The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to point out that even though there's reporting requirements in the legislation, once you approve mandatory permanent spending, then Congress loses our leverage. Creating a permanent program doesn't bode well for oversight from Congress. And programs that were mentioned like Pittman-Robertson, think about the Land and Water Conservation Fund, all of those had dedicated funding streams. This funding is coming straight out of the Treasury. It's coming out of our kids and our grandkids' piggy banks. I want to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the Claremont Review of Books, Spring 2022, entitled In the Red by Jeffrey H. Anderson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition, sadly, to H.R. 2773. Although protecting our endangered species is truly a worthy cause, our country is not fiscally sound, and to commit $1.4 billion a year in perpetuity is exactly the kind of spending that's landed us in the mess we are now in. Let me be clear. We do not have the money. In the 30 years since 1992, the national debt has increased from $4 trillion to $30 trillion. Mr. Anderson notes in his article that, quote, at that rate over the next 60 years, our debt would increase by more than 50-fold and surpass $1.5 quadrillion. In case one is wondering, a quadrillion is 1,000 trillions. Mr. Speaker, some might say, just raise taxes, but Mr. Speaker, the author of the article points out that, in fact, the federal government last year taxed over 100 times what it did in the first post-war year and spent nearly 200 times as much. So taxes are not the problem. Spending is the problem. The $1.4 billion per year is perpetual. Now, under anyone's measure, perpetuity is a long time, and since this money will never be paid back, some might say, those deep in credit card debt, we'll just pay the interest. The interest on $1.5 billion for 30 years at current rates of 3.4% is $51 million a year. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to look at the current total interest bill. It's estimated to be almost $400 billion a year, or about 8.7% of everything we spend. Why would we add to this enormous obligation? There's a quote by Ernest Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? And the answer, gradually, then suddenly. Mr. Speaker, this is exactly how bankruptcy works. You can keep spending recklessly and rack up debts for a while, even a long while, but at some point it comes to an end, abruptly. We've ignored our nation's spending problems for far too long. We've been going bankrupt gradually, and I fear the day will come when we will go bankrupt immediately. We must correct this course. For this reason, I cannot support, sadly, this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back to Mr. Westerman.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to note that hunting and angling collectively support over $200 billion in economic activity annually, including over 1.5 million jobs, as well as almost $15 billion in federal tax revenue. My home state of Michigan, the Great Lakes state, is home to almost 650,000 licensed hunters and over 1.1 million licensed fishermen and women as of last year. However, with over 40% of freshwater fish at risk and significant declines in game and non-game species that support local ecosystems, we need RAWA's investments in the on-the-ground conservation to support hunting and fishing for future generations, which is why the major sportsman groups like the Congressional Sportsman Foundation and Ducks Unlimited